In this lecture video, we're going to be looking at Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Second Discourse, or the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. One of the most famous quotes by Rousseau is that man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. It is this seeming paradox that really concerns Rousseau. And in this lecture video, we're going to see what are then the origins, what is the story that is man being born free, and yet, politically, so to speak, everywhere he is in chains. So first, just a few things about Rousseau. So he was born in 1712 in Geneva, Switzerland, and then died 1778 just outside Paris, France. Rousseau was a philosopher who was concerned with the influence of modern interests and modern developments in technology, in the arts, in economics, and the effects they have on the individual. His first famous essay, for which he actually won a prize, the Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, Rousseau actually tried to argue that the sciences and the arts did not make us more moral, but actually made us, well, more immoral, specifically, though, through what the development of what we'll see later he calls amor propria. Then we have the Discourse on the Origin and the Basis of Inequality Among Men, 1754, actually much more significant philosophically and historically than the first discourse, yet didn't win the prize for which he submitted the essay, ironically. Then we have Emile, or On Education, in 1762, which is his principal work on the philosophy of education. And then his seminal work in political philosophy, The Social Contract or Principles of Political Right, published in 1762. So the question is, right, what is the foundation of inequality among men? Rousseau is going to give us a story of the state of nature, human beings in the state of nature. So prior to civilization, what we really are if we don't live in society. So what our essence really is. And he says, well, look, there are two kinds of inequality. There's natural and physical inequality. This is something established by nature. So this concerns things like inequality in age, health, strength of body, quality of mind, or of soul. But this is not the kind of inequality that Rousseau is concerned with. He's not going to investigate why, what are the causes, what is the foundation of this kind of inequality. He's interested in moral or political inequality. And for Rousseau, this kind of inequality is not natural. It depends on a sort of convention that is established or at least authorized by the consent of men. This kind of inequality, then, it's a social inequality. We could talk about, differences in class, for example, different social practices. Talk about the poor and the rich, nobles and savages. What is the origin of this kind of inequality? So Rousseau gives a famous account of the state of nature and the slow development of human beings moving from a state of nature to civilization. The story that Rousseau tells us isn't meant to be an accurate account of what actually happened. Rousseau's a great writer, and so he writes it in such a way that it reads as a story unfolding. But what he's done is try to separate our natural moral psychology and artificial moral psychology. What are the things, how we think, how we act, what we desire, what we believe to be good and bad? What are the things that are a product of society, and what are the things that are innate? And Rousseau then comes up with these two categories. So we have a savage nature and a civilized nature. And he argues that human beings in the state of nature are actually amoral. We're not born good where we have a a sense of justice and equality and moral righteousness and so on. We can tell, like, if someone does an action, we would say, blame them and say, you need to be punished. But we are also not born selfish in the way that Hobbes thinks. We're not born wanting to just better ourselves at the expense of others. We are amoral. But since we're amoral, that means we're not interested in the kinds of things that tend to be bad in civilization. So Rousseau says, well, basically, even though human beings in the state of nature are amoral, we could, from our perspective, say they're actually morally good because they're better than we are now in society. Another feature of human beings in the state of nature is that they're politically free. There are no rules. They aren't bound by any conventions. There are no customs by which they are going to be judged. They are free to do what they please. They're free to follow their desires. The flip side of this coin, though, is that humans in the state of nature are metaphysically determined. So, again, we're distinguishing between what is a matter of convention and what is a matter of nature. Politics, for Rousseau, is a matter of convention. But metaphysically, right, what is the nature of human beings? Well, in the state of nature, we are determined. We only pursue rules that are prescribed by nature, or what we could call instinct, where we pursue, right, good shelter. We pursue food and water and sex. But we don't naturally pursue something like glory. This isn't something that exists in the state of nature. It's a social fabrication. The only operations of the soul, according to Rousseau, are to desire or not. They are to perceive or not. Just like other non-human animals. All those other kinds where we judge something and say, well, let's rank what our long-term goals are and short-term goals, and we can compare things. That doesn't occur in the state of nature because all those kinds of comparisons, that is the product of civilization. Finally, perhaps most importantly, this notion of pity. For Rousseau, humans in the state of nature have a natural pity, a natural feeling, which contributes to the mutual preservation of the entire species. Rousseau understands pity to be a kind of immediate empathy, such that we don't need to think, when we see something happen to someone else, I don't need to think, what if that was me? Right? What if I were in their shoes? How would I think about that? And then that should inform how I want to act, right? Something of like the golden rule. That is also a socially contrived thing. In the state of nature for Rousseau, human beings have this immediate sense of identifying with one another, because any kind of intermediacy is what is a product of society. That is what society is, a means of relating to one another through intermediaries. In the state of nature, everything is immediate. So this pity then allows us to identify with one another and actually work for the common good with one another. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some problems, right? We could fight with one another over some resource that we need, but we're not fighting over one another for anything that goes beyond just a natural desire or urge for self-preservation. Not self-preservation in the sense of seeking glory and things like that, of wanting to better ourselves, but just surviving. And surviving not as me as an individual, but as a human being, as a human species. So Rousseau has divorced these aspects of our moral psychology from the civilized or social aspects of our moral psychology. And those first consist in the fact that human beings in civilization are metaphysically free. So remember, in the state of nature, he says that human beings are politically free and yet metaphysically determined. But since in civilization we are bound by laws and customs and conventions, we are politically and morally enslaved. But we're not bound to follow instinct, to follow our senses and feelings and sentiment, right? We still feel the same impetus of nature. That's not gone. but we recognize we are free to resist. We can say, no, I don't want to do X, Y, or Z. Someone can tell me to do something, and I might still follow it, but I have the sense of, I don't like this. I think this is wrong, or something we could do some practice better, or some idea is better than something else. I have this kind of consciousness of my own freedom, that it could be otherwise. That is what makes us metaphysically free in civilization, even though we're politically and morally enslaved. Now, this metaphysical freedom, it is a good thing in a sense, right? It allows us to use reason to think about the ideals of justice and equality and fairness and rights and so on. But at the same time, it's not all good. Because one feature of this is that it makes us, for Rousseau, dangerously reliant on society. Because our ability to compare is a social feature. Our ability then to pursue better things, better ideals, better practices, more just practices, that also depends on society, on remaking society, on improving society. Our standards are then the product of society. Society then has negatively changed our tolerance of danger and harm. So remember, in the state of nature, Rousseau says human beings have this natural pity, this immediate association with another a human being. But in society, this ability to be metaphysically free and conscious of my own situation, I'm able to distance myself from others. That I, as a human being, can dismiss a fellow human being, even being assassinated, and put at bay the nature that would cause them, me, to identify with that person. I can disassociate from things, right? We can watch the news and read and hear about all the terrible things happening in the world, and yet not necessarily be moved to tears to do something about it. That's a product of society. That is a feature that does not exist in the state of nature, according to Rousseau. It's not a natural feature. It's a social feature. By contrast, savage humans, without aid of reason and wisdom, are always seen heedlessly yielding to the first feeling of humanity. We're unable to move beyond our immediate desires in this way. And we would say, well, look, they can't think. They can't put their feelings aside and think about the bigger picture. True. That is something that is, we would say, good about civilization, that we can do that. We can think about the long-term future of civilization and how to progress, how to do things better. But on the other hand, perhaps then this makes us more callous and crass and actually able to do more harm to human beings. Rousseau's account of the state of nature is clearly a critique of Hobbes, where Hobbes thinks the state of nature is something, nasty, brutish, and short, to war of all against all. His account of the state of nature is a kind of egoistic depiction of human beings and the harm done to other human beings through the aid of the passions. And Rousseau actually doesn't disagree with that. He says, look, if we just think about this characterization of human beings that Hobbes gives of humans in the state of nature, Rousseau says that's actually the correct account of how human beings behave. They do seek glory. They do seek to overcome diffidence. They are egoistic. But that's not human beings in the state of nature. Hobbes was describing humans in society. That behavior, the egoism that Hobbes described, that's a product of society. It's not something natural. The desire for glory is artificial. And here Rousseau distinguishes two concepts: amour de soi, which is a love of oneself, and amour propre, which is also a love of oneself, but it's a kind of vainful pride of oneself, or love of oneself, that consists in a kind of pride that wants to put oneself above others. So I'll read Rousseau's description of this. He says, pride and self-love, two passions very different in their nature and their effects, must not be confused. Self-love is a natural feeling that inclines every animal to look after its own self-preservation, and that, directed in man by reason and modified by pity, produces humanity and virtue. Pride is only a relative feeling, fabricated and born in society, that inclines every individual to attach more importance to himself than to anyone else, that inspires in men all the harm they do to one another, and that is the true source of honor. This being well understood, I say that in our primitive state, in the genuine state of nature, pride does not exist. For since every individual man regards himself as the sole spectator to observe him, as the sole being in the universe to take an interest in him, as the sole judge of his own merit, it is not possible that a sentiment that derives its source from comparisons he is not capable of making could spring up in his soul. For the same reason, this man could have neither hatred nor a desire for vengeance, passions that can arise only from the opinion that some offense has been received, and as it is contempt or the intention to harm and not the harm itself that constitutes the offense, men who do not know either how to evaluate themselves or how to compare themselves can do one another a great deal of violence, when they derive some advantage from doing so without ever offending one another. In a word, since each man scarcely views his fellow humans any differently than he would view animals of another species, he can rob the weaker of his prey or give up his own to the stronger without considering these acts of plunder as anything but natural events, without the slightest emotion of insolence or spite, and with no other passion than the sadness or joy of a good or bad outcome. So the first part of the second discourse then is describing human beings in the state of nature, that is, describing what is natural to our moral psychology and what is artificial. Rousseau insists that human beings are good by nature, but it is society that corrupts them. So the question arises, if society is composed entirely of natural good human beings, how can and how did evil ever get a foothold? What is the cause? What is the foundation of this corruption? And this will lead us to answer the question as to what is the foundation of the social and political and economic inequality among human beings. So Rousseau begins part 2 by saying, the first person who, having enclosed a plot of ground, thought of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. The true founder of civil society is the first person to construct the idea of private property, in a sense. He says, what crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared by someone who, pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch, had cried out to his fellow humans, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's and the earth is no one's." But in all likelihood, things had already reached a point where they could no longer remain as they were. For this idea of property, depending upon many prior ideas which could have arisen only successively, was not formed all at once in the human mind. So we can say property is part of the foundation of the inequality among human beings. But a lot of other things have to occur as well. That property is also a part of and then reinforces, as we'll see. A great deal of progress, he says, had to be acquired, transmitted, and increased from one age to the next before reaching the end point of the state of nature. Let us therefore start further back and try to bring together from a single viewpoint this slow succession of events and of knowledge in their most natural order. So Rousseau says that the enlightenment that resulted from this development, which is the development of comparison, of being able to compare the differences in one another, increased his superiority over the other animals by making him aware of it, how we could differ from other human beings and other animals, and how I could then pursue more of one object. Taught by experience that love of well-being is the sole impulse for human actions, he was able to discern the rare occasions when common interest could make him count on the assistance of his fellow humans, and those even rarer ones when competition should make him distrust them. So here Rousseau is saying that human beings were taught by experience the way in which if I seek to develop myself, if I seek to gather more resources for me, it allows me then to increase my difference in comparison to other human beings. And I see then in seeking this kind of love of well-being and increase in the self, I then sometimes need assistance from my fellow human beings. But I notice when they want to do the same thing and how we then start competing for the same kinds of objects. So I can't just rely on other human beings entirely to help me improve myself. So in proportion as ideas and feelings succeed one another, as mind and heart are trained, the human race continues to be tamed. Contacts spread and bonds draw tighter. We start to develop certain kinds of customs and habits for how we relate to one another. There's not the kind of just immediate spontaneity that really characterizes the state of nature. So Rousseau says, in proportion as ideas and feelings succeed one another, as mind and heart are trained, the human race continues to be tamed, contacts spread, and bonds draw tighter. They grew accustomed to assemble in front of their huts or around a large tree. Song and dance, true children of love and leisure, became the amusement, or rather the occupation, of idle men and women gathered together. Each began to look at the others and to want to be looked at himself, and public esteem had a value. The one who sang or danced the best, the most beautiful, the strongest, the most clever, or the most eloquent became the most highly considered. And this, then, was the first step toward inequality, at the same time toward vice, right? So there's this social aspect of comparison that predates the political, if we want to say, the development of private property is the political solidification of this social inequality. From these first preferences arose vanity and contempt on the one hand, and shame and envy on the other. And the fermentation caused by these new leavens eventually produced compounds fatal to happiness and innocence. So all subsequent progress has been in appearance then, right? We would say then, well, look, they're gathering around, they're starting to develop songs. This is the sign of the development of a culture. And that seems like a kind of progress, we would want to say, at least progress according to what we understand in civilization. But Rousseau says it has been in appearance so many steps toward the perfection of the individual, and in fact, it was toward the decrepitude of the species that we did not realize what we were doing in enslaving ourselves to these customs, enslaving ourselves to one another through this comparison. From the cultivation of the land, its division necessarily followed, so the division of labor, and from property, once it was recognized, the first rules of justice. So this is an idea that is really prevalent in the early modern political philosophy that even we can find in Locke, where he says, where there is no property, there can be no justice or an understanding of injury. And that's because we in society understand not just property to be objects, but we understand ourselves, our bodies, as properties. I mean, this is part of Locke's argument for the right to private property, that it is when we cultivate something, when we make it better, we have a right to it if we have transmitted part of ourselves through our labor into that object. We then think of ourselves as property as well. So there is no justice or injustice in the state of nature, but it's not that the development of the idea of justice is something necessarily wholly good, because it means there is the existence of property which enables inequality. So what is the real origin story, right? So we moved from, the story Rousseau told was of societal developments and culture, and how this then enabled the development of private property. And private property is a political category here, or at least a political economic category. So what then, if we have then the development of politics with private property, what is the real origin story of the state, of government? So remember, the origin story for Hobbes is that government originates from the desire to overcome the war of all against all, right? It's in our self-interest. Locke also says that the origin of government, the emergence of government, was also something that was in our own self-interest. But for Locke, we were able to use reason to reflect on, oh, my rights would be better preserved under government, so it would be a better existence. That's why government came to exist. But Rousseau disagrees. The origin of government did not depend on this kind of rational reflection and recognition that life in government would be better than life in the state of nature. Rousseau says that the first invented signs of wealth were land and livestock. So, of course, just certain kinds of people had more land, less land, better land, worse land, more livestock, less livestock, and so on. Eventually, these kinds of inheritances, goods, and property couldn't be enlarged except at the expense of others, because we started then to run into each other. Those then who were left out were obliged to take from the rich, who closed up all livelihood. The rich then, if they understand, look, I have a whole lot, there's a bunch of people that don't have much at all, they understand that they are outnumbered. They understand the disadvantageous prospect of perpetual war against the many who have less or have none at all. So, according to Rousseau, the rich conceived a specious plan to use the very strength of those who attacked him in his favor to make his defenders out of his adversaries, to instill different maxims in them, and to give them different institutions that were as favorable to him as natural right was adverse to him. And by him, they mean, Rousseau means human beings, the nature of human beings. That the idea of natural right is adverse to a human being, or at least a civilized being, in the way that the institutions are favorable to a civilized being. So what is the real origin story of government? That the state originates not for the benefit of all, as in the case of Hobbes and Locke, but for the benefit of the rich. And Rousseau characterizes what happens in this way. That the rich says, let us unite, he tells them, to protect the weak from oppression, restrain the ambitious, and secure for each the possession of what belongs to him. Let us institute rules of justice and peace, to which all are obliged to conform, which makes no exception for anyone, and which compensate, as it were, for the whims of fortune by subjecting the powerful and the weak alike to mutual duties. In a word, instead of turning our forces against ourselves, let us gather them together into a supreme power that governs us according to wise laws, that protects and defends all the members of the association, repulses common enemies, and maintains everlasting concord among us. So what Rousseau is saying here is that the rich get together, and they say to the many who are poor, who have less, look, how about you don't attack us, you don't steal from us, but we'll protect you. We will institute these laws, right, that are going to maintain order and stability. That is good for you, right? That's going to allow you to have a stable life, and you'll be safe and secure, and we'll guarantee it. But what is it really guaranteeing? It's guaranteeing that the rich get to keep most of the property. And so Rousseau says, all ran toward their chains, believing they were securing their freedom. For while they had enough reason to sense the advantages of political establishment, they did not have enough experience to foresee its dangers. So it would seem like Rousseau is saying government is ultimately, a trick, it's a trap, it's corrupt. We should get rid of government then, perhaps. Perhaps Rousseau is making an anarchist argument here. That's not quite the case. Rousseau actually says that we can never return to the state of nature. Once the social moral psychology had developed and the sense of amor propria had developed, once private property had developed and become an established custom, there is no returning to the state of nature. He says, once peoples are accustomed to masters, they are no longer capable of doing without them. If they try to shake off the yoke, they move all the further away from freedom, since, mistaking freedom for an unbridled license that is opposed to it, their revolutions almost always deliver up to seducers who only make their chains heavier. So if we think that we can just get rid of government, the problem is we still have the social moral psychology in us. We still think according to amor propria. We are still social beings, even if we get rid of the political institutions. So we can't but live according to the standards of society, which would mean then, if we get rid of government, we really would turn to a war of all against all, as Hobbes describes. But that doesn't mean we have to live in a tyrannical form of government, as Hobbes argues. That's the subject of the social contract, where Rousseau will try to argue what it is that we can do, that even if we can't return to the state of nature, we can have better government.